I thank you for the opportunity to speak about the past history of our synagogue congregation, Beth Israel. First of all, I'd like to give you some of the history of our synagogue, and that will include my personal history and the beginnings of the Renaissance of Congregation Beth Israel. So to commence, I was born to Rose and Alexander Diamond and raised in Schenectady, New York. We grew up in a conservative synagogue, but an observant Jewish home. My parents were civic leaders in the larger community. My dad very active in shaping the city and in the politics of the city. My mother was very active as president of Hadassah and with the synagogue's sisterhood. So I grew up with a tradition of leadership. And for education for myself, my mother said, I grew up learning about Judaism. You do it because you do it. She said, my daughter is going to learn differently. So I was sent to Hebrew school with all boys when I was a little thing of about 8. And the very first thing that happened, I think maybe the first day, you have to understand, not only was I 8, I was very small. I was surrounded by other members of my class, all males, and don't think that the plague of frogs was only in Egypt. It was all over the backyard of the synagogue, toads. So they picked up toads and they stuck them in my face and they said, what do you think of that? And I said, oh, the poor little toad. Why don't you just let it go? Well, they were so taken aback that they let it go, they accepted me. And after that, I got along very well with men in a setting, so that law school was no problem when I was one of the few women that entered law school in my generation. This is my first contact with Beth Israel. I got married to Professor Samuel Markowitz. He had a wonderful position as a professor at the University of California at Berkeley and with the Lawrence Radiation Lab, as it was called then, in Berkeley, and we came to California. We went to synagogue at Rabbi Saul White's congregation in San Francisco, Beth Shalom, I think. And but when it came time to consider what we would do for our firstborn child, immediately I thought, we can't be going to San Francisco. We have to build something here. Well, we moved into a house that was actually on McGee Avenue across the street from the synagogue. And the first thing I noticed was a big Jewish star implanted in the window. So I said, go across the street and see what's doing. And he came back and he says, it's called the Berkeley Hebrew Center, small letters, Congregation Beth Israel. But it was basically, as it turned out, a place where people socialized, and you could make a match if you were over 72 years of age. Well, at the time, I thought that was hysterical. Now I think it's necessary. At that time, the people who were composing the Berkeley Hebrew Center really belonged to other synagogues, like Beth Jacob. And the real dividing line was when we tried to become a synagogue, again, other than the first 2 days of Rosh Hashanah and a day of Yom Kippur, was they tried to raise the dues. And the big dividing line as to whether you stayed or you went was that we were trying to raise the dues from $6 a year to $10 a year. And that was a cause for a lot of debate. In the year 1960 that we came to the synagogue, the first thing that happened was that people ahead of us, Liba Feuerstein and daughter of a rabbi, had asked whether they could hold Shabbat morning services at Beth Israel, and they were assured, go ahead, that's all right with us. And we entered the scene and thought that what we needed to start building was a Hebrew school. And again, the congregation was very encouraging. We owe them such a debt, these people, because they handed us eventually a building that was mortgage-free. And that was a tremendous boost to starting the renaissance of Congregation Beth Israel. What does the role of vision play into this? Well, at that time, Sam and I both had an idea that we wanted to build a place where our child could be educated. And we both worked on it. But I had another helper, and that was Yvette Hoffer, and we formed ourselves into what we called the Committee of Two. Because it doesn't take much. If you have an idea of what you want to do, you can make it happen. And so we set about to make it happen. So when asked what I feel my contribution over the years has been to this Renaissance, I would say as follows. You are being addressed by one of the longest dues-paying members of the synagogue. I started the sisterhood. There was a ladies' auxiliary, but they met during the day, and most of us were young people with children, not working, so that husbands could stay at night and we could have a sisterhood. And I ran back and forth between the two groups to carry the information back and forth. So I was the first president of the sisterhood, and I was president several times thereafter. Sam was president of the synagogue, and his contribution in trying to keep a minyan started and going, as well as forming the first Jewish professors group that met informally for years on the campus of California. We were working to build our community in various places. We did start a Hebrew school immediately with 4 children in it, and I was on the Board of Education, which position I maintained for better than 25 years, maybe 27 years, until I finally thought, well, I don't have children here in the school, so maybe it's time to step aside and let some other people take over. I have been consistently involved with the membership of the sisterhood, which brings in a couple of thousand every year just doing that job. We featured Sunday night series, which was the way the sisterhood brought speakers, and it was our face on the community, which attracted new people to us. I started the first sisterhood donor luncheon. And, you know, if you're building something, it isn't all grim. You have to have fun. And part of that was the fact that I wrote musical comedies, maybe half a dozen of them, or co-authored them, or comedy evenings. And I even shot a movie of all of us in the synagogue performing The Miracle of the Maccabees, a marvelous Academy Award-winning documentary. In conclusion, I would like to say, as we look forward to the next 50 years, welcome to the excitement, to the fun, to the challenge of being members of Beth Israel. The poet said, "Come grow old with me, the best is yet to be." And I feel the best is yet to be for Congregation Beth Israel.
I was actually born in San Francisco, so my personal background in Jewish life was pretty nil, as most San Francisco Jews in the early years. In fact, I don't think I knew I was Jewish till I was about 6. But then I did go to Temple Shirth, Israel, where I was confirmed. I don't think we'd really ever heard of bar and bat mitzvahs. My first sort of introduction to real Judaism was at Brandeis Camp in the 50s, when it was the original people were there, Shlomo Bardeen and Max Helfman, and that was very exciting, and I really left feeling I wanted to make some kind of a commitment to a Jewish life. I went to college at UC Berkeley. I married my husband, who was a Sephardic Jew, Baghdadian family. He was born in Shanghai, and they were all traditional, which means that he was not happy in anything other than a traditional Orthodox synagogue, even though we weren't always very observant. But our children grew up at Beth Israel. We came to Berkeley in 1966, and all our children were bar and bat mitzvahed at Beth Israel. My daughter Ruth, I think, had the second bat mitzvah there after Mimi Epstein in the 70s. Two out of three were married at Beth Israel. The third one was married in Israel. And happily, they all live nice Jewish lives around the world. As I said, I joined Beth Israel. We joined when we moved to Berkeley in 1966. And I ended up, I think, getting on the board sometime in the 70s. And I was pretty much on the board, except for some absences when I moved to Israel in the 90s. And I did get back on a little bit a few years ago. So I was pretty much full-time on the board. I was president in, I think, 75, 6, and 7. And I was the second woman president after Shelley Alexander's mother, Katie, who was the first woman president. During my years at Beth Israel, there was constantly thought about getting a better building, having a school for the children. When we first went there, there were classrooms that were that you could take down inside the main shul, which was actually not very big anyway. And we really needed more room, but as it turned out, by the time you bring this up to the board and everyone thinks about it and decides if we can afford it or not, another year goes by. So one day, Shoshana Greenberg and I were walking around, I think it was when I was president, I'm not sure, in the neighborhood and saw the Jefferson Street building for sale. And we thought that could be an interesting thing for classrooms and a garden. And we both said, sometimes by the time we bring it up to the board, et cetera, it'll be long sold. So I talked to a few people, and my father at that time was selling real estate in the Bay Area. And we looked at it, and the price seemed somewhat right. So I decided to make an offer on this place. In those days, you could buy real estate here contingent on many things. So it wasn't a commitment that one had to fulfill. Anyway, the sellers agreed and gave us either a 1 or 2 month contingent for me to go to the board and get a commitment from the board to buy it. And we did that, and we ended up buying the building, lo and behold. So I think we all felt pretty good about that move. Bank loans for a shul were a little bit hard to get. So then, and my father had a bunch of cash around, which he would be happy to get some interest higher than banks pay. So we worked out a deal that he lent the money, and the shul paid less interest and he got more, so it was to everyone's advantage. And eventually, as he was getting rid of his things, it ended up getting donated to the shul over the years. The shul has obviously changed since I've been there for over 40 years. Everything changes. So there's no exception. It's a young, vibrant group, although 40-ish years ago, we were also, I think, a young, vibrant group, but in different ways. Probably, I would think that most of the younger people are more observant than we were at the beginning. There were not as many people who walked to shul, percentage-wise, in the early years, but many started, encouraged by the rabbis. But now we basically get, I think, young people that already know and want to be much more observant than in those days. I mean, my hopes are for the future that Beth Israel will continue as it is, a very vibrant modern Orthodox synagogue, which is keeping up all the traditions and the halakhic positions of the Jewish world, and also living in the modern world. And I guess that's my wish for everybody, that you should all go on and enjoy and bring up your children, hopefully, and get as much out of a community as we did. I will I'll add something that in many ways, one thing very exciting about Beth Israel has been that many of the people have kept up their friendships no matter where they've moved from years and years back. So it has really been a community in every essence of the word, where you feel part of an extended family that is there to share your joys and, unfortunately, sometimes your sorrows.
I grew up in a sort of a Jewish enclave in Bethesda, Maryland. And my parents there were founders of Congregation Bethel of Montgomery County. They were one of about 24 families that founded it in 1948, 49. And I was the third or fourth bar mitzvah. I was a real little chalutznik. And so it was a very Hamish group growing up. Also, with a very strong emphasis on service. My mother headed Hadassah. My father was on the board and was the president of the shul at one point and was involved in its building program. So that's a tradition I was exposed to. After graduating from university, it was into the Vietnam War, and I had to figure out how to do my service. I was against the war, but not against serving, so I ended up as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Public Health Service and got assigned to the regional office in San Francisco. It's how we came out here to California. And Ruth and I had just been married, and so we moved over to Berkeley because she'd just been admitted to graduate school in social work. I was working in the city, she was coming to Berkeley. We flipped a coin. It didn't matter what the coin said, we were moving to Berkeley. When it came to Berkeley in '69, Ruth basically got the yellow pages and went looking for a shul and found Beth Israel. I felt the kind of an immediate connection with Beth Israel, with the funky old building and people from an academic community and a very wide variety of people, all different kinds of backgrounds, all different levels of observance. And I just felt immediately at home. The shul bought 2230 Jefferson down the street, the Gan Shalom building. And it needed to be converted into something that could be used for a day school. Well, my background's in architecture and planning, so somebody asked would I do it. Justin Sweet and I pretty much shepherded that through. So the opportunity came to buy 1632 Bancroft. And so we bought it. Leo Davis was actually a very important person in that. And with that, we were able to open up the side yard behind 1632 and create an outdoor area for the shul and begin really to think about expanding and building out the facility. And the plans just sort of slowly unfolded over the next couple of years. We thought if we can buy 2311 Jefferson, just to the south of the shul, we can move 1632 Bancroft in back of 2311, create a duplex situation or a tenants in common situation, open up the site and expand the building. So we launched our plans to do that, and were able to purchase 2311 Jefferson and engineer a move. The problem was we were now at the point where we needed to put together a zoning application and a building plan for the remodeling and expansion of 1630 Bancroft. And so now it was time to really start turning to the fundraising and thinking about how we're going to do this. Well, so at this point, we hired a consultant on fundraising and on what our capacity would be. And the news came back very disappointing. So we were stuck, and the project just drifted along. We had some plans, but we weren't really, able to act on them. There was a famous Shabbos afternoon in November, but mid-90s. David Moss, whom I guess everybody remembers, is a very important member of the shul for a long time. He'd made Aliyah. He'd been in Israel already for a decade or more. But he kept coming back to visit from time to time. And one of his swings through Berkeley, we were chatting during Kiddush after Shabbos. And he said, "So what's this I hear about a building?" And I explained the sad story to him, and he said, "Have you given any thought to like a wooden synagogue?" And we kept the idea of the wooden synagogue going and had some meetings about it, but we didn't take any formal action on it. And the way we thought about it was to think, well, how would we actually dive into this tradition? And there I basically called on my architectural background and was greatly assisted by a book by two Polish architects, the Piechotkas, called The Wooden Synagogue. Now, the fact that that book was available itself is an amazing story. Back in the 20s, when Poland had a very brief period of independence, there was an upswelling of national pride, and one of the projects to express that pride in the national architectural program of the university were some architects looking at the cultural treasures of Poland, included in which were several hundred wooden synagogues. Two of the students at the time, the Piechotkas, made field research visits to about 200 buildings. And they photographed them, they did floor plans of them, they did measured drawings, they did site plans, so they actually created a very solid architectural record. And the project was completed, and then along came the 30s, and then came the war, and some genius saw the war coming and somehow managed to get the archives of the architecture department of the National University into a safe place during the war. At the end of the war, the Piechotkas took a personal interest in unearthing this history and published it in 1959, the book The Wooden Synagogue, and that was our reference document. On one of the pages was a little building from Przedbush. The original shape, the original design of the building was really quite beautiful. It was located in the town of Przedbush, just off the main square, the main part of town, and it was on a corner situated almost exactly the way the Bancroft building was situated at Jefferson and Bancroft Streets. And it was about the same size. And there was a kind of an aha experience. This is the model. This is what we're going to work with. But also it just seemed that the connection, carrying forward the tradition and the history was really, really important thing to do. So we put together a campaign, and when my term as president ended, I immediately shifted over to heading up the building committee and making this project happen. But we ran into 9/11, and the fundraising slowed. And so the result was that the start that we'd made ended up going in the direction that we're now in. Kind of ironically, the floor plan that we currently have at Beth Israel right now, as you could see in that zoning application, is essentially the same one filed in 1990. So the building at Beth Israel right now is the only shul in Berkeley that has its building paid for and where everybody gets to sleep at night. And that's because of the Wooden Synagogue project that we did. We did manage to get one piece of the Wooden Synagogue honored, and that is the tzedakah box. If you take a look at the front door photographs of the old Shedbush building, you'll see a wooden tzedakah box hanging there. It's identical. The one we have in Beth Israel is a replica of that. Miles Carpolo did that. And he did it with funding donated by David Whitman, my son, to make that happen. And so I'm very proud of that, and it's doing its job. Every week, people are encouraged to remember where we came from, and it still needs a brass plaque instead of a paper one, but it's there, and it's a fixture of the shul now, and a permanent reminder of the good start that we made.
I was born in Denver, Colorado, and we lived there until I was 10 years old, and we moved to Oakland. And we lived in Oakland for a year, and while we lived there, we belonged to Beth Jacob on Park. And the rabbi was Paul Lederman, and his wife was Shula. My mother opened a book and record store in Oakland on Lake Shore called The Hole in the Wall. And she originally opened it at the insistence of Paul Lederman because there was no Jewish gifts and things like that. But what happened is that my grandfather, who lived in Los Angeles at the time, knew Bill Graham through pro-Israel types of circles, introduced Bill Graham to my mom, and they started selling what at that time was the Fillmore West tickets. So it changed from a kind of a Jewish type of establishment to a hippie record store that sold rock tickets. So during that period of time, we lived in Walnut Creek for 1 year. My parents divorced, and my mom and me and my younger sister and brother moved to Los Angeles. And we all went to Hebrew Hillel Academy, which is the Orthodox day school in LA. Lived there for a year, then we moved up to Berkeley in 1971. And somehow my grandfather, who is like one of these people who knew everybody everywhere in the world, knew Rabbi Leibowitz somehow. So he was always pushing us, particularly me and my mother, that we should go to Beth Israel. So we may have gone there on a couple holidays or something like that over the years. Graduated from Berkeley High School in 1975. Through a long, interesting story, ended up in yeshiva in Jerusalem about 3 months later. Or Sameach was when Or Sameach had just started. It was maybe a couple years old. I was young. It didn't work out very well. And I ended up at Har Zion, which is a yeshiva on Mount Zion that was kind of known for like hippies, basically. So it was more, I fit there better. I had been in Israel for 2.5 years. And when I came back, I was just about to turn 20. And I came back to Denver because my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was a plumbing contractor in Denver, Colorado. Unfortunately, right at that very moment, he was diagnosed with cancer. He was a multi-pack a day, non-filtered, Camel smoker, and he passed away like about 3 months later. At that time, I was a political activist. I had a pink bread truck that I lived in, and mostly traveled around following the Grateful Dead to concerts and anti-nuke demonstrations, and hooked up with Daniel Ellsberg in Colorado, so spent some time with his group at Rocky Flats, blocking the trains on the railroad tracks and getting arrested. after some period of time, ended up in Berkeley, California. I started doing general contracting, started to do real estate sales about that time. So that was about 1985. Met Jennifer Shy. A couple houses later, and a few years later, I suppose, Jenny and I started thinking about the possibility of having kids. And we started thinking about, we were kind of part of different types of communities, but we started thinking about kind of raising a child in a certain kind of community. And Jenny knew Ezra from work, Ezra Hendon. So we kind of, I guess it was just one of those things where it's like, well, he seems halfway normal, and neither of us were really kind of into Orthodox things, but we thought we'd go check it out. That would have been about the time that Jenny decided to convert. And the Beit Din was Rabbi Hanan Feld and Rabbi Foreman and Rabbi Zach. Yeah. I started going about Israel more, meeting people and stuff like that. So about 1990, people started asking if I'd get involved in, I guess the crisis of the moment was that Beth Israel had bought Jefferson Street, the house on Jefferson Street next door. And there wasn't really any money to do anything, try to build or anything like that. And so I kind of got involved at that point, because the question is, so like, what do you do? What's the best thing to do at this point? And my recommendation was to take advantage of the fact that they own that property. It's an adjacent property, and we could move the house on Bancroft to the back of that house, create a two-house property, two condominium property, which cleared the lot next door to us, which made it possible to be able to build something. So that's what we did. What I volunteered for was that the reality of the situation was, in order to go out and hire a contractor to do what contractors do and build the building, and a lot of construction management, we just didn't have the money. And the difference between what we did have and what it was going to take to get there was basically what you pay a contractor for the profit and the overhead and the construction management. And so by not hiring a contractor and building the building in-house, like so that it was an owner-builder situation basically, you're saving a ton of money. You're not paying markups, you're absorbing a lot of overhead yourself. And of course I worked for free, so that didn't hurt. So Gone was the same thing. We enrolled Benjamin there in 1996. And we loved the place. But like the backyard, the building was old and, dilapidated. And the backyard was like concrete and a broken down wooden play structure kind of thing. And so again, it's just one of those things. It's like, gee, this could be like a really great place, and this is kind of unfortunate. And so you get people organized, and so we put the place. We did whatever you see back there now. That's when we did it. In making that improvement, it just really felt like, gee, if we could raise the money, we could like redo this whole building. It's a really crappy building. Wouldn't that be great? Stan Wolf totally deserves credit for like resurrecting it and organizing it and saying, okay, let's do it. Because quite frankly, how long had it been? 13 years, 12, 13 years. And I just kind of started from like, this is never going to happen. So I'm appreciative that Stan kind of picked up the reins and made it happen at this time. It's a good thing.
Well, I was brought up in Cape Town, South Africa, and I would say that I was brought up in a home that was very much affected by the emotional scars of my parents, especially my mother. My father came to South Africa from Lithuania, and he came penniless, and he sold coffee and tea out of sacks that he carried on his back from house to house. That wasn't that unusual for Jewish immigrants at the time. However, my mother's situation was very different. She was orphaned in a pogrom in Poland just after the First World War. And she saw in front of her the entire village and nearly all of her family killed. And Linda, in her book, The Night of the Burning, chronicles the story of how a philanthropist, Isaac Ochberg, gathered 200 of these orphans from across Europe. That included my mother. She was 8 years old, and her little sister 5, the only 2 remaining members of her family. And he gathered them plus up 200 other orphans and brought them to South Africa. So when I left South Africa, which was just after their deaths, I was very much committed, to the extent that I possibly could, to not take these burdens of the previous generation and extend them to the next. So my goal was to see what I could do to prevent that legacy from passing forward. In 1986, I sold my obstetrics and gynecology practice in Los Angeles, and I was really privileged to spend more than a year at Pardes Yeshiva in Jerusalem. And I studied with somebody you might be familiar with, Rabbi Yosef Leibowitz, and he never missed an opportunity to speak of his beloved community in Berkeley, and that was Beth Israel. So I knew at some point I was probably going to end up at Beth Israel. But I met my wife Linda in Jerusalem, and we got married in South Africa, and then we moved to the Bay Area. We spent the first year in San Francisco, and we went from shul to shul, and we never bumped into any warmth or any welcome. It was quite distressing, and we were really missing the Pardes community, and we were certainly missing Israel at that point. Now, the Beth Israel Hospitality Committee must have met the 1 week before our first visit to Beth Israel. And they must have decided the very next new people who walked through the door were going to be showered with love and affection. And in fact, we were those next people. And they poured out warmth upon us, and we haven't moved since. One of the main reasons that I became involved in the shul rebuild and then took the presidency and now am involved with the Gan Shalom rebuild is really to show my children that one's efforts really should be proportional to to those things that one cares about and feels are most important, not necessarily those things that provide the greatest financial compensation. And what I try and instill in them is that financial success, to a large extent, is reflective of society's values. So a teacher gets paid very little, and maybe a banker gets paid very much, but that's what society puts to values. However, I think community service is really what reflects one's own values. And so one of my primary reasons has been to show this practically in deeds rather than only in words. And Beth Israel is the perfect place to demonstrate this concept, and that is because many of the volunteers that we have are of limited means, and yet they spend inordinate amounts of hours volunteering for our shul. And I think that's one of the most important and endearing elements of Beth Israel life and the shul itself. In choosing the projects to be involved in, I use what I call the deathbed test. Sounds a little bit strange, but let me explain. If one were on one's deathbed thinking back as to what were the most important things that made one's life worthwhile, how high on that list would this project that you contemplate, how high would it rank? And if one feels that it would rank quite high on the list, then if it's at all possible to be involved in it and to give to it, then I would want to choose to do that. I'm also drawn to physical structures, the results of which will last, please God, many generations. The old names that are carved on the white marble in the sanctuary right now, the ones from the previous generation that we put up, those names are very motivational for me. I'm benefiting from something that somebody else did, and they didn't know who it was going to benefit in the future. And so it's enormously gratifying for someone who will not know who I ever was to benefit from my time here. And I really think that that is the chain that links the generations. For the first 10 years of me being a member of Beth Israel, I really didn't give much thought to the future of Beth Israel. My wife Linda was the volunteer, and I, to be honest, was the Noch-Schlepper. That's the one that schleps behind. And in fact, many people doubted Linda's assertion that she was even married. They had never seen this husband. So Linda volunteered me on one fateful day about 10 years ago, and Ezra Hendon reluctantly agreed to take this unknown entity. And once I got involved, and this was for the shul rebuild, once I got involved, I caught the bug and remained involved from then onwards. My dream is a beloved Beth Israel home as we have it today, and a Gan Shalom, a rebuilt Gan Shalom on 2 levels, with the first level everything that a child could want to help their emotional and their physical development at that age, even though it's rebuilt, still the home-like environment that Gan Shalom is so well known for. And then to have spaces on the second level where the teachers can relax, can meet, can better prepare in a kind of an atmosphere that is conducive for their work and their well-being. And other spaces on the second level that hopefully can be used for a variety of reasons. And so this rebuilt Gan Shalom is really the passion right now that I have, and I'm hoping that given what we've experienced that far and the generosity of the community, we will in the next year be able to move forward and build the building that we want. And in addition to that, I would love to see the culmination of the Rabbi Housing Initiative. And it's very important for us to be able to provide or assist a rabbi in this community in the Bay Area where it's so expensive to get settled, a means to be able to stay with us as the rabbi's family grows. So these 3 elements functioning on a basis of financial stability is really my dream. And of course, then the easy part, to fill it with the love and the affection and the caring that is so Beth Israel, that'll easily come. But putting the structures up and making the place where we can play out the future of what we love so much about Beth Israel, that truly is my dream.